Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's July 6th, 2024. We're going to start with a topic that's not off limits now, but was effectively off limits until last week, and that is the consequences of Joe Biden's mental deterioration, physical deterioration, and more importantly, the deterioration, the erosion of support for the Biden regime among the outer party members of the establishment, while the inner citadel of the party seems to, at least publicly, to be sticking with Biden and continuing to apologize for his presidency and the positional power that these apologists have access to in a Biden administration. Even for someone with a naturally cynical disposition, the gaslighting about Biden's condition and continued deterioration is really something to behold. For those with memories as robust as Joe Biden's, we'll play a montage here of some of the greatest hits from the shameless apologists who are at this point not even really trying to maintain any sort of serious pretense of objectivity. This is scrambling back and forth, saying whatever needs to be said, throwing at the wall whatever can be thrown at the wall, with the hope that, not even that it will necessarily stick, but that it will cause enough of a distraction to allow the next move to be made. I think it's akin to a sort of verbal or rhetorical smoke bomb that these montages like these are put out there, and then some of these figures who said these things a week ago have now reversed course entirely, done a complete 180, and are now in opposition to Biden's continued candidacy. Some of them have flipped 180 and then flipped 180 degrees again back to where they initially were as they try to scramble to figure out what exactly the party line is and what status is required, or what is required to be said to maintain status, to maintain within the confines of the opinion of the ruling party, of the establishment.
This version of Biden, intellectually, analytically, is the best Biden ever.
He is sharp, intensely probing, and detail-oriented and focused.
For example, we have 1,000 trillionaires in America. Billionaires in America.
This is a man who is sharp, who is on top of his game, who knows what's going on.
He's smart. He's on his game. His mental acuity is great.
This is a very sharp president.
And the people that I've talked to say he's as sharp as a tack. He's fine.
They say he's sharp.
There's not a problem. He was sharp.
He was sharper than anyone I've spoken to.
The president is sharp, and he is tireless. He is sharp.
As sharp as ever.
And he's fine. All this right-wing propaganda that his mental acuity is declined is wrong.
His brain is good. He's still great.
He is sharp in meetings.
I believe the people who say that behind closed doors, Joe Biden remains sharp.
In meetings, Joe Biden is sharp.
He's sharp. He's fit.
There is nothing to these challenges, these suggestions that somehow he's not sharp. He's sharp as a tack.
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
That brings to mind for me, as life so invariably does, a Simpsons clip from the show's second season, just as it was entering that season 2/season 3 to season 10 golden age.
Yellow. Uh-huh. Well, you know what? I'm glad you're nervous, because that means we're on the right track. Uh-huh. 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 All right. Okay, this is what you're going to do. You're going to hang up, call me back, and say the exact opposite of everything you just said. Goodbye. Bart, Lisa, come over here.
What is it, Unky Herb?
I want you to hear what the guys down at the plant think of your old man. Yellow.
Homer Simpson is a brilliant man with lots of well-thought-out
practical ideas. He is ensuring the financial security of this company for years to come. Oh, yes. And his personal hygiene is above reproach.
Whoa, I just great, Homer. I'm impressed.
Pretty good, eh?
The rules governing the Democratic nomination process effectively preclude Joe Biden being removed by anything other than a voluntary, at least publicly facing voluntary stepping aside. Though while it's, of course, absurd to imagine that Joe Biden is making any of his own decisions at this point, those in his camp don't actually enjoy as much independence as the official rules might otherwise have us believe if we take it at face value. There are countless ways that pressure could be applied to Biden and Biden's hangers-on to cause him to step down. So many that it almost seems silly to go through them. They're one by one. There is Burisma, Hunter Biden, Ashley Biden's diary, Tara Reid, plagiarism. There are countless angles that the pressure could come from. Someone as much of a swamp creature as Joe Biden, it really doesn't get much swampier than that, who has decades of time served in the imperial capital and who has accumulated a corresponding dossier from all the three-letter intelligence agencies of all the corruption that he's been involved in, that the only real point of leverage that Biden will have if the powers that be decide that he needs to get out is that he has the Samson option. Because yes, he is involved in several decades of corruption, but he isn't involved solitarily. He has connections. It's the web. One can only imagine what that web of relationships, corrupt relationships with so many other power players in elite circles, that if he wants to, he can say, if I'm going down, the entire palace is going down too. I'm pushing the pillars and bringing the whole thing down on everyone, and it's going to be a massive implosion in credibility among the power centers in the American empire. We've darkly joked in the past that as escalation against Trump continues and the lawfare that was hoped to dispatch Trump failed, that one of the natural steps further down the line would be to JFK, the former president. But I think that option also remains a dark potential for the current president. And in the case of Joe Biden, the proverbial slipped in the shower or fell down the stairs is not just a figure of speech. It's a literal story that could happen, or at least could be plausibly believed to have happened. So the ability to knock him off and cover it up, it's hard to imagine someone that it would be easier to pull off on than Joe Biden. The perpetual surveillance notwithstanding, because as we've seen in cases like Jeffrey Epstein, the monitoring in the panopticon that we live in with cameras and microphones everywhere, when the institutional power centers need something not to be made public, not to be viewable, not to be recorded or heard, everything can suddenly malfunction. The cameras don't work, and the geo-tracking data is inexplicably corrupted at exactly the pertinent spots. And so that might be as likely a scenario as a voluntary withdrawal of Joe Biden as a means of getting him to step out of the way. That said, I remain skeptical that he will be removed. I think keeping him at the top of the ticket, there are just too many people who benefit from a marionette like Biden when they are the ones, the prestidigitators at the top with their hands on the strings, that are able to use the power that the presidency and the executive branch afford them without ever being identified or even having to worry about internally with any sort of retribution from the person holding the public-facing office holder of the president. Additionally, if the stuff does hit the fan, then there is a very convenient scapegoat there who can be discarded, thrown on the funeral pyre, and with that, all of the problems that have led to the populist uprising on the right and the left to a lesser extent, all of the problems, the underlying problems that have caused that, can be rhetorically blamed on Joe Biden after Biden is gone. So he effectively allows for the establishment to do whatever it needs to do, no matter how poorly that lands from a public relations perspective. Once he's gone, it's all the fault of that old retrograde, racist, dead white man. And if you don't think that they can turn again and portray Joe Biden that way, as many of his opponents did in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary season, then we're just not paying attention, because we've seen in the span of just a week, the perceptions make successive 180-degree turns in terms of how Biden is presented, how he's portrayed. And so it takes little imagination to perceive that in the future he will be discarded when whoever succeeds him needs to jettison his negative legacy. They will be able to do that by wrapping it up in all of the isms and phobics that they need to. In noting that the rumors of Biden stepping aside are premature on the technicality that they haven't gone through the process of actually occurring up to this point, I'm not making any bold observation. In fact, if we look at the betting markets, predict it right now has Biden at a 41% chance of winning the Democratic presidential nomination. That sounds like a pretty good figure to put on the chances, trying to handicap the race, because as meteorologists well know, that 40%, if you say there's a 40% chance of something, say a 40% chance of rain, and it doesn't rain, well, you said there was only a 40% chance of it raining, a 60% chance that, by implication, that it wouldn't. And if it does rain, well, you said there was a pretty good chance that there could be rain and people needed to look out for it. So you can manage it so that you're not really wrong either way. That's another way of saying, perhaps a cop-out way of saying that this prediction is a tough one to make from the outside looking in at this point, and it is not difficult to see how it could go either way. But it does look like it's going to stay in the family, so to speak, at this point, because the only potential candidate with a higher percentage chance based on the predicted market as of this recording is Kamala Harris at 44%. We mentioned the previous week how Michelle Obama wasn't included in any of the share listings, and how if we reverse engineered that, it looked like maybe it came to a 1% chance or so of her getting the nomination. That was pre-debate. Now, post-debate, with the surrounding fallout of that and Joe Biden's corresponding decline in chance at maintaining the presidential nomination, Michelle Obama has been included in the predicted market, and she is sitting at just 8% or 7% now. It just dropped a percentage point as I was speaking. It's a distant fourth place, and it's Kamala Harris at 44%, Joe Biden at 41%, Gavin Newsom at 9%, Michelle Obama at 7%, Gretchen Whitmer at 6%, Hillary Clinton has dropped down to 3%, and then after that it is 2% and below for the remaining candidates. So the smart money is looking at the Democratic nomination as a two-person race, and it is between the two people who were on the 2020 ticket. And since there was no nominating process at all for the Democrats in the 2024 election cycle, while the Democratic delegates that have been picked up by Biden effectively running unopposed in the caucus and primary states are pledged only to Joe Biden as president, who is then able, or as presidential candidate, who is then able to pick a vice presidential companion to run with him. And there aren't rules that explicitly state that it has to be Kamala Harris. Effectively, for all intents and purposes, with how the modern Democratic Party is arranged and the way that conventions run, it is effectively inconceivable that without Kamala Harris also voluntarily stepping aside, that she would not be the vice presidential nominee running beside Biden. And so if Biden were to step aside voluntarily but Kamala Harris refused to, then it is there's no viable path for anyone else to upstage her and take the top of the ticket from her. And while the dossier of corruption on Harris isn't going to be as extensive as it is on Joe Biden, there is surely more than enough fodder there to take her out. She has a Samson option of her own that exists via a confluence of a couple factors. One, there isn't any sort of Fannie Willis, at least to my knowledge, any level of like Fannie Willis type of very blatant out front corruption that could turn public sentiment against her enough to negate the perception that will surely arise from her being so pressured that it is a consequence of a racist and sexist, an effective legal glass ceiling that would be holding her down. And if the first female, first black, first Indian vice presidential candidate who is next in line for the presidency is so unceremoniously tossed aside, her ability to shriek, something she does have a natural capacity for, her ability to shriek and be grating in her criticism of the Democratic Party specifically and the broader American system more generally, could cause a lot of problems for the ticket that is slotted in at her expense. And she's not demented and she's not elderly, but she is every bit as politically ambitious as Joe Biden is. And so, as unlikely as I think it is for Joe Biden to voluntarily step aside, I think it is even less likely that Kamala Harris would do so. And so consequently, it becomes a nomination fight between the current president and the current vice president for who will run at the top of the presidential ticket in 2024. And to the objection that Harris is less electorally popular than Joe Biden, to the extent that that even matters, and I'm skeptical that it does, because nothing that this establishment does is on the up and up. And so why should we presume that the elections are not an exception to that, given the huge spoils involved? If they'll lie about an experimental, quote, vaccine, unquote, to ensure that Moderna and Pfizer have good end-of-the-year P&L statements, why would they not lie for control of the entire kit and caboodle when it's obvious that in doing so they'll be able to get away with it? If the framework, the rhetorical framework in reaction to questions about the 2020 election have already been laid out such that it is a clear status demarker to contest the validity of any aspect of the democratic process as it takes place in the United States. You're a bad person if you question the outcome of the 2020 election, and so you're an even worse person if you question the outcome of the 2024 election. I'm not saying that as a prediction for the future. I'm saying that is already what the standard is, and the standard will not change between now and Inauguration Day in 2025. It won't change until this entire imperial system collapses. And so with so much on the line, with so much to gain, and with no downside to being caught violating the rules, why not do the old Rey Mysterio Jr. thing and cheat to win? It's a rhetorical question. But anyway, that aside, polling from YouGov and The Economist released just in the last week ask respondents about their perceived favorability of Joe Biden and of Kamala Harris, and Harris actually comes out modestly better than Biden does. Favorability figures with the general population for Biden, and that's taking the percentages who view the person favorably and subtracting from that the percentages who view him unfavorably. Biden's overall favorability is a negative 19, whereas Harris's is a negative 16. And among independents, Biden comes in at negative 32, whereas Harris comes in at negative 28. So that's 3 points among the general population, and perhaps more importantly, 4 points among independents that Harris does better than Biden does in terms of favorability. Whether or not Harris's slight edge could stand in the face of a public back and forth debate with Trump is a question that doesn't need to be answered, because it's highly unlikely, even if she does become the Democratic nominee, that she would be on the same stage as Trump. The debate, or the debates, have already happened, is one tactic Team Harris could use. Another one would be to go the indignation route that I think I thought it was possible that Team Biden would have done to avoid the debate in the first place. To say, this guy's a convicted felon, he tried to instigate an insurrection, he's a rapist, he's misogynistic, he's worse than Hitler, and we're not dignifying his candidacy by engaging with him. We're taking our message straight to the American people. The anyone but Trump motto gets a jolt, some rejuvenation, when that anyone is someone who is not a zombie rotting on stage for the entire world to see. On the question of how voters, the ones who ostensibly run this whole democratic process, on the question of how they feel about Biden remaining in the race or withdrawing, YouGov economists ask, and the way that they did this is a little bit disappointing. They ask Biden supporters, those who intend to vote for Biden in 2024, if he should withdraw or not from the race. And they ask the same of Trump among Trump or intended Trump voters. So Biden voters were asked, should Biden drop out? And Trump voters were asked, should Trump drop out? But Biden voters were not asked if Trump should drop out, and Trump voters, more interesting, Trump voters were not asked if Biden should drop out, or at least if they were asked for whatever reason, those results were not included in the poll, which seems a bit inexplicable, because these surveys that YouGov Economist releases are the lengths of small books. The one I'm looking at now is 118 pages long. I suspect that virtually all Biden supporters would say that they think Trump should withdraw from the race, but I think that a significant number, perhaps a majority, if not a significant minority of Trump voters, would say that Biden should not withdraw. But anyway, working with the figures that we do have, Biden supporters, 50% say that he should remain in the race. 32% say withdraw, and the residual 18% say unsure. That's in stark contrast to the sentiment among Trump supporters, with 86% saying he should remain in the race, 7% saying he should withdraw, and 7% saying not sure. So by a factor of more than 4, Biden voters think that Biden should withdraw relative to Trump voters thinking that Trump should withdraw. So the fallout from Biden's debate performance among his supporters is far more significant than the fallout, to the extent that there was any, among intended Trump supporters for his conviction and continuing legal troubles. Speaking of favorability, the same Economist YouGov poll asked respondents about their favorability of the recently liberated Julian Assange, and the results are not encouraging. Among Democrats, he has a favorability of -19. Among independents, it's flat at 0, and among Republicans, it's at a -5. There is a generational divide as well. Among Zoomers, it's +3. Among millennials, it's a +2. Among Xers, who gave us the internet and the corresponding freedom that was the dream of the internet to come along with it, with so many of the founding figures of the internet as we know it today, is a -13, and for boomers it's a -20. Interestingly, whites are the least favorably disposed to Assange, with a -10 favorability. Blacks come in at -6, and Hispanics at a +6. So this is another instance of souls, white liberals and black rednecks playing out, or non-white rednecks playing out, with, of course, a higher percentage of whites being Republican, and Republicans are relatively less hostile towards Assange than Democrats are, and yet the core constituencies of the Democratic Party, blacks and to a lesser extent Hispanics, are more favorably inclined towards Assange than whites are. And so the racial and partisan affiliation sub-crosstabs are not broken out, but we can pretty easily tease out from what we have here that white liberals really despise Assange, white conservatives have a mixed view on him, and non-whites are the biggest supporters of Assange, even though they are disproportionately Democrat in partisan affiliation. Totally orthogonal to anything we've been discussing up to this point. I want to finish this week by talking about a plan by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to cull nearly 500,000 barred owls on the West Coast. Reading from a PBS News article, quote, "To save the imperiled spotted owl from potential extinction, U.S. wildlife officials are embracing a contentious plan to deploy trained shooters into dense West Coast forests to kill almost 500,000 barred owls that are crowding out their smaller cousins. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on Wednesday was expected to release its final plan to prop up declining spotted owl populations in Oregon, Washington State, and California. The plan calls for killing up to 470,000 barred owls over 3 decades after the birds from the eastern U.S. encroached into the territory of 2 West Coast owls, northern spotted owls and California spotted owls. The smaller spotted owls have been unable to compete for food and habitat with the invaders." End quote. Invaders, that sounds kind of nativistic. It's dehumanizing, or in this case, de-strixifying language being employed there. What claim do spotted owls have on the forests in California and Oregon and Washington that preclude barred owls from settling there? Aside from the stark contrast in the way that, quote, invasions, unquote, are perceived when it comes to animal migrations versus human migrations, aside, the selective concern about biodiversity without regard to biomass, really to the total exclusion of concerns about biomass, is worth pointing out because it is fundamentally anti-life in some ways. Is it worth killing 100,000 barred owls in an area so that 10,000 spotted owls that might otherwise not survive can live in an area? And if so, why? Simply because there are fewer of them? If that were a real, genuinely, sincerely held principle, I suppose that'd bode well for people of European descent, and not so well for those of sub-Saharan African descent. They could be facing a culling in the future as they are identified as an invasive species that is making it more difficult for their smaller human cousins to survive. In seriousness, if not totally unrelated to that analogy aforementioned, isn't this just Darwinian selection pressures at work? This is from a secular scientific perspective. This is natural selection at work. In a Darwinian framework, there is no Noah's Ark where 2 of every species is put on to flourish until the end of time. It's a Darwinian struggle, and certain species will emerge, and then they will be snuffed out as other species that are better adapted to their surroundings are able to replace the older species. To which an environmentalist operating in a Darwinian framework with a mind as sharp as a tack might retort, well, humans intervening on behalf of the spotted owl is an evolutionary advantage that spotted owls enjoy because humans are not separate from the rest of the natural world when it comes to Darwinian selection pressures and the arbitrary decision to perceive human interventions as some sort of artifice that is inherently anti-natural in its inclination is incorrect. And though it might be inadvertent for whatever reason or whatever host of reasons, spotted owls are accorded a high level of respect and their survivability deemed a worthy objective for humans to realize that it manifests itself as a survival advantage where they might not otherwise be able to make it. In the case of spotted owls, it's a happy accident for the creatures, but in the case of, say, domesticated dogs, it is not a happy accident. It is a very clearly refined survival strategy that has been honed over tens of thousands of years, such that domesticated dogs are some of the most successful animals on the planet from a Darwinian perspective, despite the fact that without their benefactors, they would find their populations drastically collapsing across the world, with a majority of breeds going extinct in the span of a single canine generation. Anecdotally, here in Eagleland in the Midwestern United States, over the last 2 decades, I can attest as a sort of amateur raptor watcher that the barred owl population has absolutely exploded in recent years. I used to see the occasional great horned owl here and there during the day. They constituted probably 90% of the owl spottings that I saw, with barn owls, not to be confused with barred owls, B-A-R-N, barn owls, making up the other 10%, 5 to 10% or so of owl spottings. And until about 5 years ago, I had never seen a barred owl once in the wild. I distinctly remember a walk along a trail near my house, a forested trail near where I live in the winter when the trees were all bare, seeing for the first time a barred owl perched almost eye level on a tree just 15, 20 feet ahead, and being delighted by the novelty. I recognized it as a barred owl, but had never seen one before. They have a sort of haunting, otherworldly visage, and it was beautiful to behold one against the backdrop of a gray, wintry, snowy day where the snow was suppressing all other sounds. For a moment in my world, it was myself and the owl in a landscape devoid of much else organic. Now, however, I see them constantly. It's an almost daily occurrence. In terms of owl sighting distribution, it probably runs something like 95% of the owls I see now are barred owls. 4.5% great horned owls and the remaining 0.5% barn owls, with the absolute number of sightings of great horned owls and barn owls probably being reduced by a factor of 5 or so, to such an extent that I would buy on its face the assertion that barred owls are also having a negative impact on the survivability of other owls, notably great horned owls and barn owls, in Winnett, as they are allegedly having a negative impact on spotted owls on the West Coast. But if great horned owls are 90% of the owl population prior to the barred owls' arrival, and then they are reduced by a factor of 5, and it takes them to 5% or a little less than 5% of the owl population because barred owls make up the remaining 90%, that insinuates a more than doubling of the total population of owls, even though it comes at the expense of great horned owls and barn owls. And so in some sense, at least if the trend continued down to 0 for great horned owls and barn owls, and in this way, the analogy really doesn't hold as well as it does for spotted owls, because spotted owls are admittedly rarer and in greater danger of extinction than great horned owls, certainly, or barn owls are. If the trend in this area continued to such an extent that great horned owls and barn owls went away, replaced by barred owls, we would have a reduction in the biodiversity of owls, but we would have a substantial increase in the biomass of owls. As for which outcome is preferable in some objective sense, I have no idea. But as someone who enjoys seeing owls more than he enjoys not seeing owls, not upset about the barred owls' success. And I wish them the best in avoiding the bullets of Western rifle shooters. And they're going to need that, because barred owls, by far of any owls I've come into contact with, are the least skittish when it comes to interacting with humans. Sniping them might not be quite as easy as shooting fish in a barrel, but I don't think it's going to be much more difficult. And I'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.